Okay, well, it's a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Cherryl Hunt. Cherryl is one of those rare people I talked about at the beginning of the course who has 2 PhDs, a doctor. She was a molecular biologist for many years and started off life as a research scientist. And then she turned to theology, did a master's in theology, and worked on a project in Exeter University on the Bible and environmental ethics, and then she has fairly recently completed a doctorate in theology looking at how Christians read their scriptures in a variety of contexts. I also should say that she and I have been friends for, we couldn't work out how long, but probably 30 years, yes. So only 30, yeah. So it's a double pleasure for me to have her here. And she's going to talk a little bit on biblical approaches to the environment, which is the kind of partner talk to the one that Hafia gave us yesterday. Over to you, Cherryl.
Thank you. So, following on, you'll notice this morning there'll be quite a good number of echoes from Hafia's talk yesterday afternoon. A number of the issues that came up then are also found in Christian reflection on the environment through reading the Bible. So you can sort of tick off a few points as we go through that will be familiar. Interestingly, I think, Hafia, you entitled your talk A Quranic Approach to the Environment. Looking at, because originally when we were a double bill, it said biblical and Quranic approaches. And I've kept the plural here, you will notice, because as is often the case with religious texts, there are a number of different readings of some particular parts of the text, and people therefore come to somewhat different conclusions as to what the Bible might be contributing towards our thinking on the environment. So hence the plural here. And I will kind of highlight as I go through which areas are more up for debate than others. So the first thing to say, we'll see here, shall I move this over a little bit? The first thing to say is that when we come to the biblical texts, it's not our environment, it's God's creation. Environment, as we were hearing yesterday about our environs, the surroundings, it's a term which is very us-centered, very human-centered, because when we talk about the environment, we really mean our environment, the thing that keeps us going, our life support system. Whereas the Bible is talking about God's creation, and it's a much more theocentric, a God-centered approach rather than an us-centered approach. So I'm going to be using creation as the term throughout the rest of the talk. Now, as is common ground with yesterday, it's clear in the biblical text that the creation is all God's work. Everything comes from God, as created by God. And we find that at the beginning, the very first text in the Jewish Tanakh, the Christian Old Testament, is in Genesis, the beginning of the book of Genesis, in the beginning when God created the heavens and the earth. And it's interesting, in contrast with other ancient Near Eastern accounts of creation, how the Hebrew text here does not try to explain where God came from. It assumes God, and starts with where creation came from, and creation starts with God speaking creation into being. And interestingly, we find here this notion of the breath or the Spirit of God sweeping across the face of the waters, and God's words here, let there be light. And this assumes particular significance for Christian reflection, because in the Christian texts, we find an understanding that Christ is part of this process of creation. So at the beginning of John's Gospel, John consciously echoes the beginning of Genesis when he says, in the beginning. So this is conscious allusion to Genesis text. But for John, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And he's obviously, it becomes apparent later on, he's referring to Jesus Christ. So here we've got this identification of Christ with the Word spoken at creation. And in fact, within Christian theology, perceiving a Trinitarian God, a triune God, we see Father, Spirit, and Word, i.e. Christ, all involved in the creation. So in a Christian understanding, we see the triune God, three persons of the Trinity, all involved in the creation of the world. Something else which becomes apparent in the biblical text is that this was not an accident. Again, in contrast to ancient Near Eastern accounts where you might find somebody making the earth from the dismembered corpse of a god that happens to be hanging around. Here you have a very deliberate project. In Genesis, it's very clear that God sets out to create, and that's echoed throughout other Hebrew texts. I've given you a few references there, and just one example from Psalm 102. Speaking to God, long ago you laid the foundations of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. A very consistent throughout the scriptures acknowledgement that this is something that God set about doing deliberately. In fact, some of the texts even talk about God in terms almost of an architect laying out plans and building the foundations. The next thing we notice is that God is pleased with and delights in creation. And this is obvious from the original Genesis account, where you've got this repeated 7 times, God saw it and it was good. And then finally, it was very good on day 6 when God has created the animals and humans. It's very good. And again, I've just got an example here from day 5. God created the great sea monsters and every living creature that moves of every kind with which the waters swarm, and every winged bird of every kind. And God saw that it was good. So there's this satisfaction, kind of divine satisfaction in what is made. Interestingly, it's not now. I hesitate to talk about Hebrew with Hilary here because she knows Hebrew a lot more than I do, but it's not a word that indicates perfection, but a kind of a goodness, a fit for purpose, a wholeness. And we find this echoed too in other parts of Job. There's the book of Job is where Job is talking to God. God has allowed the accuser to take away all Job's possessions, and his family have died, and he's having this sort of argument, if you like, with God, complaining about what's happened to him. And then God replies in 3 or 4 majestic chapters of Job. And it's basically God sort of saying, were you there when I put the stars in place and all this? And there's an element, I don't think I'm being disrespectful, of God kind of being proud. You know, have you seen these things? There's a delight in what God is creating here. Can you hunt the prey for the lion or satisfy the appetites of the young lion? Look at Behemoth, which I made. There's a joy in these texts when God is addressing Job, a joy in the creation. And also an intimation here where we see, can you hunt the prey for the lion? Who provides for the raven its prey? That creation is not something that God made and then left to its own devices to kind of run along on its own, but that creation is something with which God is still intimately involved on a day-to-day basis. This is not a clockwork universe where God sets it up and leaves it, but one where God is involved in it. And furthermore, the very existence of creation testifies to God. So you can see from looking at the world that it tells us something about God. Psalm 19 is very interesting here in that it says, the heavens are telling the glory of God, and the firmament, that's the dome that they envisaged the sky to be, proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours forth speech, and night to night declares knowledge. And then it goes on, there is no speech, nor are there words. Their voice is not heard, yet their voice goes out through all the earth. So this is not something you can hear with your ears, but somehow the very existence of creation testifies to the Creator. Furthermore, some of the language in the Hebrew scriptures seems to indicate that creation, not just humans, but the whole of creation, responds to God. It's Psalm 98 is an example of this. Let the sea roar and all that fills it, the world and those who live in it. So that's including humans, but everything else. Let the floods clap their hands and the hills sing together for joy at the presence of the Lord. So there's this call for creation to respond to God. Now, this is one of the Psalms, and some people would see this as a poetic turn of phrase. But others would say, well, actually, in seeing the flowers, the trees, whatever, as expressing what they are, in some sense, that brings glory to God. We can see the glory of God expressed through the creation. Going back to what I said earlier about the fact that God is still involved in creation, we find this again, this sense within the Hebrew writings in the Christian Old Testament, the Jewish Tanakh, this sense of God having this ongoing relationship. So the psalmist says here, you, to God, you make springs gush forth in the valleys. And then talking about giving drink to every wild animal, the birds have their habitation. From your lofty abode, you water the mountains. The earth is satisfied with the fruit of your work. You cause the grass to grow. And there's this sense in which if God withdraws God's activity, things will cease to be. Things will cease to work. There's this ongoing involvement of God with the creation. And we find that also the sense in the New Testament writings. So this is some of Jesus' teaching from Matthew's Gospel. And Jesus is telling his followers not to worry about what they need for everyday life because God knows what they need. Jesus said, look at the birds of the air. They neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. Yet I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not clothed like one of these. So there's this sense in which God provides for everything. However, at the same time in this passage, we can see there's a distinction being drawn between humanity and the rest of creation. So God provides for everything. God clothes the flowers, if you like, and feeds the birds. But he says, oops, sorry, wrong button. No. He says here, are you not of more value than they? And here, will he not much more clothe you of little faith? So there's this sense in which God is sustaining the whole of creation, and yet there is a special provision, a special relationship between God and humanity. And this is clear in the next passage from Luke's Gospel, where Jesus is recording as saying, are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 pennies, yet not one of them is forgotten in God's sight. So the birds are known to God. But even the hairs of your head are all counted. Don't be afraid, you are of more value than many sparrows. So again, there's this sense in which humanity has very special value within the creation. And this will be important as we see later. Now, so we have this kind of clear indication that God is involved in creation on an ongoing basis, this sense within the biblical text that this is not just a machine, a well-oiled machine going on around us. Our environment is not just there as a support mechanism for humanity. The question arises more, and that's generally agreed, I think, by most biblical readers. What there's more debate about is how much God's care for and involvement in the non-human creation extends into the future. In some Jewish thought, and has been carried over and modified by Paul in early Christian reflection on the subject, there's the idea of the 2 ages. We're in the present age, and the present age is not perfect. It's characterized by imperfection, and there's evil. But there will come a point when the age to come starts, and the age to come is going to be an age when all will be well, and God will bring shalom, that sense they were talking about yesterday afternoon, that sense of well-being and wholeness will come to the whole of creation. This shalom is going to be brought into being by God. There'll be doing away with evil. There'll be no more weeping, no more crying, no more pain. And the junction between the present age and the age to come is seen as, often characterized as, the day of the Lord. And so this phrase, the day of the Lord, sometimes gets used to talk about a time of judgment in Israel's history, but it's also sort of the day of the Lord is going to be the time when the age to come begins. Now, in Paul's thinking, we find in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul, because he's had this encounter with Christ and he's convinced that Christ is risen from the dead, and the resurrection is a mark of the age to come, Paul sees the age to come as already having started. And there's this overlap, because Paul is acutely aware that things are not perfect, that the world is still going on as it was. But because Christ has been raised from the dead, in Paul's understanding, the age to come has already started, and we have this overlap, these two ages. Now, the question occurs in Christian reflection on the text that we have as to what role, if any, the non-human creation, I'm waving out my hand out the window towards the garden as a kind of representative slot of it, what role the non-human creation will have in the age to come. So that's why I've put age to come question mark. Does God's relationship with creation extend into that future? And that's where there's more debate. So first of all, let's have a look at what some of the texts say. So we have within the Hebrew scriptures various intimations of what will happen in the future, but it's probably most clear in the Isaiah prophecies, and this is from Isaiah 65, where God says, "For I am about to create new heavens and a new earth. The former things shall not be remembered or come to mind. Be glad and rejoice forever in what I'm creating." He talks about Jerusalem. I've left some bits out here, but no more shall the sound of weeping be heard, or the cry of distress. That's the absence of pain and distress. The picture that Isaiah is building up here to start with seems like a kind of just present life made perfect. So you've got an old person will live out the full lifetime. There's no intimation here that of a living forever, but living a full lifetime. People will have long lives, and they won't bear children for calamity, as it says in the next text. Their offspring will be blessed. And then it goes on with a rather intriguing passage here. "The wolf and the lamb shall feed together. The lion shall eat straw like the ox, but the serpent its food shall be dust." Now, this is an obvious allusion to the Genesis text, where after Adam and Eve eat the fruit, the serpent is cursed and is cursed to eat dust. So this is obviously an allusion to that. So there's this kind of a resolution and fulfillment perhaps of that. But this, keep putting the wrong button. The wolf and the lamb feeding together. This could be a kind of, the main problems you have as a pastoral people in the ancient Near East perhaps were things like wild animals coming in and eating your livestock. So this is the kind of promise that the wild animals will not cause you so much trouble in the future. But it seems to be more than that. It's not that the wolves and things will disappear, which you might think would be the perfect solution. If all the wild animals disappear, we can get on and have our livestock without any trouble. But actually, the wolf and the lamb will feed together. The lion shall eat straw like the ox. And in another text, you've got a child playing with a snake and that kind of. So you've got this idea of not just that all the difficulties will be removed, but somehow the non-human creation will be integrated into this future existence in a very strange, and we can't imagine how, way, but they will be integrated in there. And we find that again echoed in the later New Testament texts. So in the letter to the church in Colossae, we have this, it's what's known as the Colossian hymn. It's a short passage, which is kind of a lyrical kind of passage talking about Christ. Wrong button again. In him, that's Christ, all things in heaven and on earth were created. So this is one of the passages I mentioned earlier, where there's a Christian understanding. Christ is part of that, the Godhead involved in creation of all of the living world. And then it goes on, things visible and invisible, so we're including spiritual and physical things. All things have been created through him and for him. And then there's this continuation. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And this is possibly an allusion to Stoic ideas, where there was this idea of the universe being held in place by God, or almost within God. There's this sense in which everything will fall apart without the continuous work of God to hold it together. And here we're saying in Christ all things are holding together. So there's this involvement of Christ in the maintenance of the relationship between God and creation. Then it goes on to talk about the church for a bit. And then after that it says, through him God was pleased to reconcile to himself all things. We have all things several times in this passage, whether on earth or in heaven, by making peace through the blood of his cross. And this is seen as, by many, as an indication that what Christians see as Christ's redemptive work, the life, the death, the resurrection and the ascension of Christ, what theologians sometimes call the Christ event for shorthand, is not just for humanity. There's a sense here in which what Christ has done and what God is doing in his kind of work of redeeming creation is not just involving humanity, but is actually involving non-human creation. And particularly with this repetition of all things here, is this sense in which it's catching up the whole of creation. And so this is one of those passages that's used to say, by some to say, well, actually, everything, in some way, everything that's created has some future in God in the age to come. And as we'll see, that's important when we think about how we might care for the environment. Another passage that's often used when thinking about environmental issues in the New Testament is this passage in Romans 8. And here we see creation, and there's been lots of work on this passage. The majority opinion is that here, when it's talking about creation, it means non-human creation. So here the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the children of God. And then it talks about creation being subject to futility. This is often related back to the way Adam and Eve are told that they will have to do more work to till the earth, that the earth is less productive than it might be. But it's also been interpreted more recently as a possible metaphor for the way life, the wonderful world that we have, has been produced by a process of death and extinction. But you've got this bondage to decay mentioned here. But the creation will obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. We know the whole creation has been groaning in labour pains. Now, the labour pains are often used as this sort of pregnancy pains. These labour pains are often used as a metaphor for that transition between the present age and the age to come. In Jewish thought, there's this kind of idea of it's painful, it's difficult, but there will be a joyful outcome. So these labour pains, possible allusion to that. And not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly because we aren't living in the age to come yet, as we wait for the redemption of our bodies. So this sense here in which, and that the language is creation waiting with eager longing, is the imagery is of creation kind of standing on tiptoe, expectation, that there is some future for creation. There's this tantalizing allusion to it in this letter to the church in Rome. Not unpacked, as I'll say later, there are good reasons for understanding why that isn't unpacked there, but this tantalizing allusion to a role for the rest of creation in the future, in the age to come. In contrast, and the reason why some people would dispute that kind of understanding of the future for creation, we get some passages in the Bible which seem to indicate that when God brings about the age to come, everything that is currently here will be burnt up, pulled down, disappear. The language differs depending on the text. And 2 Peter is one particular clear example of this. This is the second letter of Peter in the New Testament. The day of the Lord, as I mentioned earlier, will come like a thief. That's a metaphor for unexpected. And then the heavens will pass away with a loud noise, and the elements will be dissolved with fire, and the earth and everything that is done on it will be disclosed. Now, the problem here is that we have early texts of this particular letter, But the Greek actually differs. In some of our early texts, it says the earth and everything that is done on it will be disclosed or revealed. And other early texts say burnt up. Different Greek word. It's not a case of interpretation, but a textual anomaly, if you like. So if you even if you go with the disclosed here, it goes on to talk about the heavens being set ablaze and the elements melting with fire, and we wait for the new heavens and the new earth. And so some would say, well, it's all very well saying this is God's creation and God is keeping it going, but it's all going to be pulled down. In the age to come, it's going to be a completely new start. Now, what the implications of that thinking might be for our relationship with the environment, we'll unpack a little bit in a moment. This is just another text, a similar kind of language. New heaven and new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. But as I said, with this, the age to come is characterized by God being with his people. God is among mortals, he will dwell with them. He will be his peoples. And this wiping away every tear, no more death, mourning or crying. So again, it's this characterization of the age to come, but it's a new heaven and a new earth. So that's kind of the way some of the biblical texts talk about creation and non-human creation specifically. What I'd like to do now, I mean that's kind of more like the God's relationship perhaps with creation. What I'd like to do now is to explore what we have in terms of thinking about humanity's relationship to the rest of creation, to non-human creation. I don't like calling it non-human because that's a bit of a negative way to describe it, but the rest, the larger part perhaps of creation. So we're going back now to the beginning of the Old Testament, the Jewish scriptures, the first book, Genesis, after we have the 7 days pattern of creation, or in the process of that, we have this comment about humanity being made in God's image, and having dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over the cattle. So that's we've just had this division. You've got the animals in the sea, the animals in the air, and on the land you've got two types of animals in biblical understanding, domestic and non-domestic, the cattle and wild animals, and all the creeping things. And humanity is given dominion. And then we have, so God created humankind, having said to God's self, we'll do that. God creates humankind, and then God says, be to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion. And you have the repetition of the dominion. And God gives the humans the green things to eat. It's not until later in Genesis, after the flood, that humanity is allowed to kill and eat animals. So here we have this relationship. But this passage, this subdue and have dominion, is another one of the passages over which there's been a lot of debate. I'm going to have to speed up. So one of the words here, radar, has been interpreted as a kind of taming, nature seen as kind of wild and needs to be disciplined and used. And there's some thinking, particularly this is around the time of the Renaissance, of Francis Bacon's thinking, the idea that the dominion that God gave Adam and Eve was lost when Adam and Eve sinned against God. And that the scientific understanding that was becoming more current at the time was going to enable humanity to regain this dominion. There's this part in Bacon, I forget where he says, I've come leading nature as your sort of handmaid and your slave. It's taming nature, it's making nature serve humanity. And this is seen as this recovery of human dominion. So it's a good thing. Science and technological progress are seen as a good thing. And this is echoed nowadays in the reflections of some a minority, I would say, of scholars. Calvin Beisner is one American theologian who reflects on this, that environmental devastation, he says, is often portrayed in the text as being caused by God, and wilderness is very often a negative image in the biblical texts. And he sees human technological progress as a foretaste of the restoration of the cursed creation foretold by Paul. So there's again this sense, echoing Bacon's view centuries ago, that science and technology enable humanity to recover a dominion which they were supposed to have. In contrast to this is another interpretation within the Christian tradition, where it's pointed out that what is given is God's dominion, and God doesn't go around smashing things up, because God exercises, as we saw in many of those earlier passages, a nurturing role. God provides food for the animals. God provides the rain to water the crops. This provision to nurture flourishing is part of God's dominion. And therefore, when humanity is given God's dominion, it isn't for humanity to go out and tame the wilderness and turn it into a park, or even turn it into a monoculture farm, but it's a dominion that's given for humanity to nurture what is there and to help it flourish. Yes, for humanity to flourish, but to make it all flourish. So there's this sense in which this, to some extent, gives rise to what is often termed stewardship, a stewardship interpretation of the Christian text, which sees humanity as God's caretakers, stewards, looking after the planet for God, not being given it as a sort of playground or something they can trash to their heart's content because it's just their life support system, but something that they should nourish. The other term here, subdue, has caused a lot of debate about what it means. And Beisner, as I've mentioned earlier, he takes this as both this and dominion conveying strong, forceful subjugation. Michael Northcott suggests that this kind of taming the wilderness motif is something that the Puritans took to the New World with them. And this kind of taming the frontier, the Wild West mentality of taming the wildness, is something that's come from that very early kind of approach towards science and technology and progress. And even other scholars who are very much on the kind of the green end of the spectrum and would want to promote Christian care for the environment, some of them see problems with this language. Norman Habel says there is nothing gentle about kabash. That you can't make this sound nice. It's the sort of language people used when they were conquering people. It authorizes control over the non-human elements of creation, some would argue. On the other side, there are those who look to the Genesis text as talking about God bringing order as God creates, and therefore that human subduing is not a kind of bashing things over the head, but it's a bringing order and nurturing that flourishing through bringing order to the creation as God's image bearers. So there are some debate over how to interpret this kind of original mandate back in Genesis across the Christian traditions. So summing up a little bit, there have been several attempts amongst scholars over the last few years to try and come up with some models for understanding the biblical teaching on the environment, in inverted commas, and therefore to help shape Christian reflection on environmental ethics. One such, focusing on the Old Testament, you'll find derived from the work of John Barton, Chris Wright, and our own Hilary Marlowe here, focuses on the fact that the texts are theocentric. They are God-centered. This is the whole understanding. It's not, we tend to see things as us-centered, to remind us that things are theocentric. And that when humanity, and obviously in the text it's talking about Israel, but from a Christian reading of the Old Testament, we can see these texts applying to humanity more widely. The moral framework of our action is determined by our relationship with God. So that's the first kind of angle to think about. So our morality is derived from our relationship with God and is practiced, ethical attitudes are practiced within our communities. But the third part of the triangle, if you like, which is very often spoken of in terms of the land or the earth in the Hebrew scriptures, we might now talk about non-human creation. So our relationship with non-human creation should be determined by this relationship with God. And there's this need to consider God's relationship with this and our relationship and our morality derived from God in the context of this. You can't just look at this on its own. You have to have all these kind of interrelationships. And this is interrelationship, and the fact that we're all part of a living community, not just a human community, but a community of life, needs to be thought about when we come to think about how we respond to the environment. Finally, then another possible approach, which has, although it's been looking at the whole of the Bible, has focused more primarily on the New Testament, and particularly on Paul's writings, is the one that I was involved in. UB is just uses of the Bible and environmental ethics, so just the shorthand, couldn't fit it all in here. And this was, we were looking at how Christians had used the text to think about environment, reflecting on the fact that there's lots of texts in the Old Testament which talk about creation and God and the relationship between them, but most texts in the New Testament seem to give teaching dealing with humans' relationship with God, but other than that, it's mainly to do with how humans should treat one another. Those kind of interpersonal relationships perhaps focus more in, for instance, the letters of Paul and in Jesus' teachings in the Gospels. And those can be fruitful, because you'll find, for instance, a group like Tear Fund, which are very keen on promoting good approaches to the environment, will often root their argument in the need to love neighbour. So this love your neighbour as yourself, which is found in the Old Testament teaching and echoed in the New Testament, that the law is summed up in loving your neighbour as yourself. And they'll root this, you should do this, you should live in this way in relationship to the environment, you should care for the environment because, for instance, your use of energy is affecting rising flood levels in Bangladesh, or crop yields in parts of South America. So there's an anthropocentric, a human-centered motivation for us to care for the earth. We should care for the earth because we are then caring for fellow humans. So and there's nothing wrong with that, but that is kind of a major motivation that's used, I find, in much Christian writing on the subject. It's harder to pull out much other than those two texts I looked at earlier, Romans and Colossians, that seem to give any indication of the non-human creation within the New Testament. And so with our project, we decided that rather than sort of look for things which other people would debate, well, is it about that or not, we would actually say, okay, we're going to look at the text with a view to finding some roots for Christian approaches to the environment from the Bible. We're not going to pretend they're there, but we're going to try and see if we can make some. So we went to the Romans 8 passage and sort of looked at how that had been used in Christian reflection. Again, so thinking about the creation being set free from bondage to decay and having some role in the age to come. And we looked also at the way that the Colossians passage had been used in Christian reflection, and is particularly in how there were good reasons to think that in the Romans passage it was talking about non-human creation, and doing sort of the historical readings as well, there were reasons to think that this was to apply this to other things other than humanity, that there was some indication in Paul's writings that God's project of redemption involved more than just humanity. And so then, taking that kind of lens, if you like, of that project, looking at how the New Testament teaches Christians should behave towards other people and extending those principles to the non-human creation. So looking at, for instance, there's a lot in Paul's writings about Christ giving himself in the crucifixion and the resurrection. Christ was actually giving himself in coming as a human being in the incarnation, that Christ put the good of others before self, was self-limiting in that sense, and thinking about how human lifestyles could think about self-limiting in terms of the good of the wider ecosystem. So can we think about ways of humans making more space for other species because they don't need any, taking more than we need is one of the causes for depleting resources, this kind of living beyond what we really need. This self-restriction might be a good model for us to think about. I'm just going to go through these quickly. Okay, right, thank you. Yeah, we started a bit late. Another strong theme in Paul is fellowship, and this derives to some extent from his sense of believers in Christ being part of the body of Christ. And he talks a lot about being in Christ. You are in Christ when he talks to believers. And this also plays out in his references to love of neighbour, and this sense in which he asks, for instance, the churches, give out of your plenty that others might have enough. And again, this sense of thinking about how much humanity uses and how much we use in terms of resources, we could be caused to reflect on how much we as human beings use and how much we need to use in the context of us being in part of a relationship in a community with non-human creation, not just with other humans, but with the wider species. Now, are we giving species enough room to live? Are we keeping ecosystems and restricting the human spread in order to enable them to have enough space to live? So this kind of these are just kind of pointers, if you like, as far as we got with this project. Thirdly, the whole reconciliation and peacemaking, which comes out particularly in this passage in Colossians. God pleased to reconcile to himself all things. We have elsewhere this idea of making peace. Now, peacemaking is something which this kind of wolf and the lamb lying together, this kind of imagery is found in some of the Old Testament texts. And of course, there are limitations. How we can't expect wolves to lie down with lambs in the current way they are, and to expect lions to eat straw. But that vision of what will be can be used as a spur to what Christians do now in the biblical worldview. Miroslav Volf, talking of intrahuman reconciliation in the context of the conflict in the Balkans, talks about human reconciliation being a messianic problem, and it can't be completed until the age to come is fully here, and when humans will be reconciled with one another. But he says, in the meantime, we can, I quote, struggle for a non-final reconciliation based on a vision of reconciliation that cannot be undone. So based on the vision of the reconciliation that God will bring among people, we can strive for reconciliation now. And in the same way, possibly, with a view to the reconciliation that the Christian scriptures seem to speak of between different elements of creation, that all will be in the age to come somehow reconciled, we can seek to bring about some kind of reconciliation, at least between humanity and non-human creation. That might start with, for instance, trying to eat less meat, trying to ensure animal welfare standards and things like that. It's nothing like the full story, but it's a movement in that direction based on a vision of what's to come. And there is within the New Testament, and you can't get around it, it's anthropocentric, it's human-centered. It's about people, but it's an anthropocentrism that implies a responsibility for the rest of the world, for the rest of creation, in the sense of humanity being given this role in God's kind of economy, if you like. So, are there biblical approaches towards the environment? Well, yes, there are. The Bible isn't set up to answer the questions that we bring to it now, because those kinds of questions weren't there for the writers of the text, either for the Old or the New Testament. They did have some awareness of pollution, for instance, around mines and things like that, but the whole idea of us being able to wreak the havoc that we have done wouldn't have been an issue. So we do need a response to these problems that are around nowadays, I think there's an acknowledgement across Christian traditions that all is God's creation. It's all precious to God and has a role in God's ongoing purposes. But when we approach the texts, we need to have some humility for the place of humanity. We need to remember that in the biblical text it seems clear God has an interest in other things than us. But also from our own point of view, when we come to the text, we need to be aware of our own biases, our own preconceptions, and our uncanny ability to find the answers we want to find when we come to our religious texts. And I think that's probably true across the traditions. A need for humility and an openness to hear what the texts are saying to us. Thank you very much.
So lots of issues touched on there, and I'm sure there are questions. Who'd like to start? Thanks.
You mention about the need to be sort of sensible stewards of the environment, and I don't for anything have any issue with that at all, and I take that on board completely. I just sort of think about those passages in the Old Testament where sort of the Israelites are told to sort of go in somewhere and effectively completely trash the place. Not only are they expected to sort of defeat the people who are there, but then they're expected to sort of destroy their crops, destroy their animals, destroy their everything else, and basically lay the place completely to waste.
And throw stones on the fields.
Well, exactly. I mean, I just wondered where that sort of thing sort of fitted into the sort of picture that you've been creating, or perhaps it doesn't. But
well, I think some of those are obviously very specific situations that the texts are addressing there. But it's interesting because you've got one where, I can remember one particular story, I can't remember where it is, where they throw stones on the fields as they go, the soldiers are told to throw one stone each. That kind effectively is you're going to make it very difficult for them to grow crops another year. But there's also instruction that when you go to war, you're not to chop the trees down. With a kind of, what have the trees done to you? You're not at war with the trees. Which I always find an interesting kind of... so suddenly pop this into instructions about going to war. So I think obviously there are some specific issues where different things. I mean, and obviously people did chop things down. They did eat animals. There was an acceptance that was part and parcel of life. But I think there is that even when they are given the right to kill animals, there's always this. But you mustn't eat the blood. You must drain the blood, and why? Because that's a kind of acknowledgement that the life of the animal comes from God, and it's God's property that you've used. And also, again, of course, when the Israelites go into the land which God has said He's promised them, it's not, well, here's the promised land, march in. It's, this is mine, so you're tenants. And there's very much that kind of sense of God, the land belongs to God, and the people are tenants on it even then. But yeah, I appreciate there are those passages which, particular circumstances, I think, where things do get destroyed. Yeah. I mean, it isn't a tidy picture, and that's why I think there's so much debate about it.
This isn't so much to do with the physical environment so much, but more so to do with us and the view that God has an ongoing interaction and hand in all creation. What would be the response to babies born with congenital heart defects and disabilities, cystic fibrosis, that sort of
the kind of natural evil question? Yeah. I mean, I think that obviously that came up a bit yesterday as well. There are different ways of understanding natural evil, and certainly one of them is now to recognise. Well, I think it's Polkinghorne's term that it's the best of all possible worlds. In that, if God wanted to make something, a system, a universe, which was going to generate something of our kind of mental capacity with whom God could have a relationship, then you make a universe where these things happen and life is developed in the way it is with DNA, and so you're going to have things that go wrong. It's if you like, it sounds callous, but it's, if you like, the price you pay for the world that you have. For all the times things go right, it's going to go wrong. But if you didn't have that kind of mutations going wrong every so often, then you would never have life in the first place. It is that sort of, it's not perfect in the sense of what we might, if we were God, we would make a world where nobody was born with any defects. But it's kind of one of those things where it's the world that God has made is made to generate us. And obviously I'm referring to the whole process of evolution relies on those kinds of things, and they throw up, unfortunately, bad effects as well.
But I guess that implies a sort of God standing away, that he's not involved in every intimate
in terms
creation.
Of God not deciding on each particular decay of an atom.
Exactly,
There's the
right.
whole thing.
Yeah.
I mean, I think God's action in the world is another whole project, another whole subject. But there are different kind of accounts of that. Some would talk about God intervening at different times. What I think, again, Polkinghorne calls a capricious interventionist God. And others possibly seeing God kind of involvement at a kind of quantum level where we wouldn't be able to see it. And others say, well, no, God is maintaining it all, but isn't kind of micromanaging every, to a certain extent the system works. Okay. And there's that sense in which if the constants of gravity and the charge and the electron and all the kind of the basic constants of the universe weren't exactly what they are, then the universe wouldn't cohere, wouldn't hold together. So that sense in which God's maintaining creation but not micromanaging, I think is one which I personally find most satisfying. But there are different approaches to tackling that.
Mohammed, did you have a question?
Thank you very much. You mentioned, or you referred to the passage from Isaiah 65, 17 to 25, and you mentioned that according to that, it seems like the earth will not be destroyed, but it would be a continuation of the earth, and things would improve.
Yes, yeah.
And then, especially with regards to death, you mentioned that people would live a full life.
Yes, yeah.
But not an everlasting life. But at the same time, Revelations 21, 1-4, it mentions that death will be no more.
Yes, absolutely.
And in the Isaiah as well, the first verse is, "For I am about to create new heavens and new earth." So what view did you take? It wasn't clear.
Well, the new heavens and new earth is a kind of a promise. It's Isaiah, the prophecies, and very often with the Hebrew prophets, obviously they're addressing the situations they're seeing, but sometimes they're making promises about dependent on people's behaviour, and sometimes they're making promises about the immediate future, and sometimes in Christian understanding we can kind of see another fulfilment of that further on. And there's a development in that, as I think Michael was saying yesterday, how the earliest writings don't foresee a life after death at all, and the later Jewish writings actually come up with some understanding of life after death. And in the same way, the development of ideas as Isaiah's time, the age to come would be one where human existence would be full, and people wouldn't die early, and babies wouldn't die young, and there wouldn't be a lot of suffering. But it wasn't seen as an eternal life. Whereas when ideas developed more about resurrection and the life after death, by the time of the New Testament, there was a variety of opinions, but most Jewish understanding, as I understand it, was that there would be a resurrection of the dead, and there would be a judgment, and that would be on the day of the Lord. So this sign that God was bringing in this new heaven and new earth was that the dead would be raised, and they would be living in this new heaven and new earth. And therefore, by the time of the New Testament, there was an understanding that there was a life to come. in the new heaven and the earth. So it's kind of moved on from Isaiah's time, when the vision was there's going to be, their understanding was everything's going to be made right by God, but they didn't see it as an eternal life. Whereas by the 1st century, there was an expectation of a resurrection of the dead, and this life would be lived, this afterlife would be lived in the new heaven and the new earth. So the understanding had changed over that time. With the kind of the passing away, I didn't get a chance to kind of unpack that a bit more. On Christian reflection on the environment has been influenced quite a bit by Christian understandings of this transition between the present heaven and earth and the new heaven and earth. So some would say, well, if you think that everything's going to be burnt up, and this is a minority opinion, but you do find it on some websites, notably from the other side of the Atlantic. As one website pithily put it, if you think we're trashing the earth, wait till you see what Jesus is going to do to it. And another that suggested that Christians involved in environmental care were like brain surgeons who stopped to unblock the toilet. But there's that sense in which, if it's all going to be trashed anyway, it really doesn't matter what we do. And almost from that 2 Peter where it says, earnestly desire and work towards, maybe if we trash it faster, God will come, Jesus will come back sooner. And that is a minority view, but I couldn't say, unfortunately, that it isn't there somewhere in the Christian tradition. Others would say, well, even if it's going to get destroyed, then in the same way as I don't trash my body, even though I believe I'm going to get a new body in the life to come, I look after it because it's God's gift to me and I'm responsible for it. In the same way, we should care for the earth, even if we think it's all going to be remodeled or whatever, or pulled down. And others argue more strongly for a sense in which the new heavens and the new earth are renewed. So there's a greater sense of continuity between what's here and what will be. But even, I think it's fair to say that Eddie Adams has done some work on those texts, and he said really in most of them there does seem to be an expectation that the texts are talking about a, how does he put it, recycled universe, where God, there isn't a kind of complete destruction of everything and a creation again from scratch, but a kind of dismantling and a rebuilding, that everything will be made new. And that if it's going to be that fundamental, then we can't sort of say, we need to look after this because this will be the state it's going to be in the age to come. God's going to make all things new. So I think the argument about whether the earth will be destroyed or not is a bit of a sideshow, but for some people it's become very important as a kind of a reason for looking after things.
Okay, lots of hands going up now. Okay, we'll have to have quick questions. I saw Bruno first, then Paulson, then Eunicia,
I'd like to add,
and then Kent.
within the same issue of what continues and the last things, just 2 quick things. I think first thing, even though not openly spoken, but I came across many Christians, and I come from a Christian tradition, that although not necessarily spoken, but there is this belief that yes, there will be new heavens and new earth, and I'm fine with my life here. And there is no sense of a theology that understands that what will last, what will continue, and are we going to participate in God's redeeming work? And it reminds me when Jesus addressed, I can't remember in which gospel says, something related to something I said, when the Son of Man returns, will he find faith on earth? So obviously it's not, we'll find a context where there will be love to each other, there will be a respect to each other. So there are some issues it implies responsibility, and maybe underlying this lack of concern, or actually lack of obeying our stewardship, maybe it's our lack of understanding what will last, or how our contribution, how our calling here by God will actually have an impact eternally.
Yes,
Okay.
I think that's perhaps true of lots of other issues, not just environmental care. Yeah, I mean, there isn't really an answer to that beyond this kind of sense of that what is of God will last and what is not of God won't last, and that's true of our own individual lives as well as the works. There's that passage in Paul's letter where he talks about people, their work is hay and stubble, it will get burnt up, but if they're building with good stuff, it will last. And again, that's a warning, isn't it, to not, you don't just sit on your hands and wait to be saved, but there's a responsibility. Thank you.
Paulson, did you have a question?
You did mention that there's a thought that science and technology will recover dominion for all creation. And looking at the challenge of pollution, which is, in my view, almost 80% science and technology resulting. Looking into the future, I don't see how science and technology are going to help in recovering the environment.
Well, I mean, yes. I mean, obviously, the idea that science and technology help us subdue nature is one that started in the Renaissance time and is often seen, is understood by some historians, not all, as a kind of motivator behind the Western drive and the Industrial Revolution and everything that kind of led to. Others would see that as just as a byproduct, but not connect it with the mandate in Genesis. I do think, however, I don't think one ever stops being a scientist. I feel like saying former scientist, but you can't stop. I do think that although science has helped us do these things and make things, and the technology has applied it, but I think sometimes we're going to have to look to science and technology for the solutions to some of these things, because they are problems caused by science and technology, and we are going to have to look to science and technology to help us deal with some of them. However, to do that, it's this change in human attitudes which is at the root of things, because you can only well, they say the human heart's the hardest thing to change. It's human attitudes that are going to motivate the approaches that are going to try and find the technological solutions. But I don't know if that answers your question. But to my mind, if you've got a pollution problem, some of it is trying to deal with the human greed that's led to the shortcuts that have caused it. But some of it is, okay, now we need to clean it up, so we need to find some technological bioremediation or something like that. So I think that some of the immediate issues are going to need scientific solutions. Is that what you meant? Is that kind of, I'm not quite sure whether I
come from a country where we have cut trees to set up factories, where we have reclaimed swamps to put up industries.
Right, yeah.
And we are now struggling to recover our agriculture.
Yeah.
And we are using scientific means to recover our agriculture after getting rid of the swamps where the waters were. So I do understand when you say we are going to use science means to solve science-caused problems.
Yeah.
And I keep thinking about it.
Yeah, but you do need that heart attitude and that sense of humility in applying any scientific approach that says, actually, let's try this because let's see how it works, because there can be a kind of gung-ho, oh, we know what we're doing. And I mean, things like the cane toad in Australia are a classic example. We'll bring this foreign animal in to deal with one of the pests, and then the animal you've brought in becomes an even bigger pest than the one you had to start with. So there is that sense of humility which scientists need as much as biblical interpreters, that sense of our own limitations. So.
If I may interject, I think that Pope Francis actually put it quite nicely in his encyclical Laudato Si, which I would recommend everybody to read. It's addressed to faith communities all over. But he talked about what he called the technocratic dominance, the idea that every problem has a technological solution, which really just does dominate people's thinking at the moment, and the need to, as you say, with humility, recognize that technology is, in fact, he didn't use these words, but I would say it is a good servant, but a poor master. And if our lives are just focusing on technological solutions, and I mean, you hear of technological solutions being postulated for climate change that, kind of are completely unfathomable, the knock-on effects they might have. So the idea that technology can solve all our problems is a really bad idea, but it can be useful sometimes.
I have two questions. The first is, I want to know, in the Christian system, do you have some suggestion for food? So what kind of food is, what kind of animal is edible, what kind of is not? And is there some herbal is useful, and is there some herbal is harmful? So is there some suggestion from the Bible? And the second question is, what's the attitude for the Bible to hunting for fun, not for food?
Okay, right. Okay, a couple of interesting questions.
Controversial issues.
Okay, well, the first, to tackle the first question, within the Old Testament, the Jewish Tanakh, there are, as I said at the beginning, the humans are given the green things to eat, and then after the flood account, Noah and his family are given permission to kill animals. When you come to the establishment, or the calling out of Israel from Egypt and Moses and the giving of the law, then a part of the covenant that Moses makes with God and between God and the descendants of Abraham is through Isaac, is the fact that there are certain foods that are clean and some foods that are unclean. And this is not so much a kind of, although we can, looking back now, see, well, there probably are very good reasons why you shouldn't be eating some of those. It's in the context of then concepts of ritual purity. So there were things that made you unclean if you touched them or things like that. And in the same way, some animals were unclean. So they were only allowed to eat a certain set of animals. Now, when we come to the New Testament, the issue of ritual purity comes up in some of Jesus' teachings. And by that time, it had got elaborated to a certain extent, so that people had clear instructions on more everyday things about what they should do to make sure they stayed pure, ritually pure. This is a ritual thing rather than a moral purity, if you know what I mean. And Jesus actually criticizes at one point people who worry about staying ritually pure, but their hearts aren't pure. And then there are a couple of places where Jesus says things which then, when they're recorded by the gospel writers, and also this is mentioned in Paul's letters, which predate the gospels, that Jesus effectively declares all food clean, because he's talking about cleanliness is to do with what comes out of the heart. It's to do with the type of person you are rather than what you eat and whether you wash your hands and things like that. And so there's an understanding, starts very early on in Christian tradition, that all foods are clean. So and although probably many of the Jewish Christ followers in the early church probably kept up their traditions of what they ate and what they didn't eat, there were no restrictions put on non-Jewish Christ followers. Beyond, very early on, there's a suggestion that they don't eat meat with the blood in, because that kind of goes back to the time of Noah, and that's a suggestion. That and avoiding meat that has been offered to idols in sacrifice. So beyond that, there's no restrictions in the Christian scriptures, and church tradition has been that all foods are clean. So now hunting. That's interesting. I can't think of anything specific. Can you? There's stuff about not eating corpses of animals if you find them in the wild, isn't there?
I mean, I think that I would say that that's an issue that isn't explicitly addressed in the Bible, but that it's an issue that Christians nowadays think about, particularly in environmental contexts, is whether you should eat meat or not.
Yes,
I
absolutely.
should say,
Although nowadays it's probably eating meat is more as an environmentally positive move, because meat is an inefficient way of getting energy rather than for any other reason. Although I do know one or two Christians who don't eat meat with blood in it because they feel that that's something that's still beholden on them. But yes, I mean, certainly nowadays there are many who would say it's okay to kill something you're going to eat, but to kill it just for something frivolous like the fur or for fun, many Christians would find that unpalatable nowadays, but I know, some do. But I think, probably certainly killing for eating. And killing for fur years ago, when you needed the coat to wear because it was cold in the winter, it would be something different, but for sort of just for frivolous reasons.
As the hall of Madingley was once for hunting.
Yes.
The
Oh,
site
yes.
up
Yeah,
here.
there are
it's
plenty
really
of Christians who do hunt. I'm sure
Yeah,
there are quite a few.
it looks like to show some kind of people, they have the right, they can control this land. And
Yeah.
all of the animals or creatures, maybe they can make the control. I don't know. It looks like to show the social role or
Historically,
Yeah,
and hunting would have been something, well, obviously the poor people would have hunted for food, but the rich people would have hunted for fun for years, yeah, definitely, and it would be a power thing to some extent.
Okay, we're nearly out of time, but I did see Johan's hand. So I think this will have to be the last question.
Thank you. I think this is just a very fundamental question. I wasn't still quite sure how can we understand the cause of those like earthquake, tsunami, these kind of these problems. And also, are there any narrative in the Bible tell us the difference between the new heaven and the new earth? Do they share the same natural environment, or do they look totally different, or where human were live?
Thank you. The answer to the first bit about the natural disasters is a bit similar to the understanding that, for instance, of Polkinghorne for the genetic disorders would be that the way DNA works just throws up errors, and that was the way to generate us through the process of evolution. Similarly, some would argue that the reason life was possible on this earth, apart from the earth being the right distance from the sun and so that water is a liquid, and being the right size and things, is that we have a what's the word? Crust with the plates. We have tectonic plates. That's the word I'm looking for. And the fact that the Earth has a dynamic internal structure, and that the plates, the continental plates, move around, and it has a magnetosphere, a kind of magnetic field around the Earth. The geology of the Earth too is essential for the development of life on the planet. If we didn't have the magnetosphere, which is generated by the geology of the Earth, probably anything that did develop would have been killed off by solar radiation of cosmic rays over the years. But the Earth is protected from cosmic rays by the fact that it has this magnetic field around it. And if it was set up differently, then it wouldn't have that. But the side effect of these continental plates moving around on this liquid inside is that you get earthquakes and volcanoes, and so again it would be seen as a best possible world, a kind of that's a sort of side effect of the world that we live in, that was necessary to nurture life. So that, I mean, I'm not saying that is but that's the only kind of apologetic I can think of myself for that. But in the new heaven and new earth, no, there are lots of questions like, what's the new body, the spiritual body that we were looking at in the scriptural reasoning last night, that spiritual body that Paul talks about, the body of the life to come, which was in that Corinthian passage last night, those of you who are here. Paul doesn't describe what it is like, and neither does it say precisely what the new heavens and new earth will be like, save that God will be with God's creation in it, and that suffering and pain will be gone. So the picture language that's used is, you won't need a sun because God will be your light. So there's this kind of intimacy between God and God's creation. That seems to be a feature of the new earth and the new heaven, but there isn't any kind of description as such. Possibly because the kind of language you would need would be misunderstood by us. I mean, when people have this thing came out yesterday, so I'll try to be quick, about if somebody is disabled and what kind of body, would they want an abled body in the life to come? Do you remember they were talking about it? Michael Thompson was talking about it yesterday. And this idea about, people saying, well, my disability is part of my identity and I wouldn't want to be whole-bodied. my response to that is yes, but you don't even know if you're going to have a head, 2 arms and 2 legs. You might be triangular or spherical. I mean, there is no indication of what the new body is going to be like. Maybe it's going to be something completely different, and that the ability or disability is going to be completely irrelevant. We have no description of it. I mean, I know what Michael was saying yesterday, or it might have been the speaker, about we know what the body's going to be like a bit because we see, we know Jesus' body is described in the New Testament text. Jesus' resurrection body has his scars. So there's this sense in which there's this continuity. And I mean, yes, but Jesus was raised after 3 days in the tomb. Most of us are going to be raised when we're dust. And I don't think we can necessarily say because Jesus didn't, I mean, in some cases, Jesus didn't even look like Jesus to the people who saw his resurrection appearances. So I think people sometimes put too much on the accounts of the resurrection of Jesus as a template for us. Yes, it's a guarantee of Christian understanding is a guarantee of a resurrection body, but that doesn't necessarily mean resurrection bodies generally are going to be anything like this shape. This is the result of evolution, and goodness only knows what we're going to look like. But I think maybe it's going to be something indescribable. So.
Wow. On that note, ponder this over coffee. Discuss amongst yourselves what shape will you have in the new heavens, and let's say thank you to Cherryl for a stimulating talk.